Hello, how's everybody doing? All right, we are ready to end the Cold War, which we've been covering for over a month now. And we've covered Latin America, we've covered China, we've covered the of the Cold War and some of the alliances. And now we're going to get into how exactly the Cold War ended. Now we're going to be using a new presentation that I came together for this. So let me pull that up real quick. There we go. All right, so let me just push this aside. And before we can get into the end of the Cold War, we need to talk a little bit about how we got here. So, after World War II, Stalin was running the USSR, and USSR had been traumatized by World War II and World War I. They got invaded twice, and they lost tens of millions of people each time. And so he wanted to create buffer zones, areas that would protect the USSR from future imperialist aggression, is the way that he called it. And so the Red Army, when they liberated Eastern Europe from the Nazis, they just stayed. And afterwards, they put in place satellite puppet governments that were controlled by the Soviet Union. But this would be an ongoing source of tension for the whole 5 decades of the Cold War, because many of these Eastern European nations did not want the single party, authoritarian, centralized bureaucracy that represented Soviet Russia. And especially, they didn't appreciate the lack of civil liberties, the lack of freedom of expression, of press, of political party and affiliation, of assembly that Western nations have come to expect from their governments, but that was completely out of the question in the authoritarian, totalitarian state that was the Soviet Union and their satellite countries. Now, Stalin didn't stick around very long, though. In 1953, he died. And after his death, there was a power vacuum. And that power vacuum was filled by Nikita Khrushchev. Now, Nikita Khrushchev is a fascinating individual. He tried to come in as a reformer, and his primary reform was what he called de-Stalinization. Now, de-Stalinization meant removing the policies by Stalin that he felt like were holding his country back. So it mostly looked like eliminating the cult of personality that Stalin had built around himself. He had made statues everywhere. There was pictures of him in every government building. He renamed cities, such as Stalingrad, to be named after himself. But then Khrushchev comes along and he gives this speech in February of 1956 criticizing Stalin. And all of the Politburo are like, oh, somebody's saying something bad about Stalin. That used to get you arrested or killed. But in this case, he's in charge now. And so Khrushchev was able to say that and say, Stalin brought himself too high. He put himself above the party. And he was incompetent. How did we lose 25 million people during World War II? Those human wave tactics were a tragedy, a travesty. And so he renamed Stalingrad to Volgograd after the city that it's, the river that it's on. He disinterred Stalin's remains and took him out of Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square. And he tried to reduce the power of Stalin's cult of personality. And so what this looked like was, beyond removing statues, which he definitely did, and changing names, he also had political reforms. So he tried to basically reveal Stalin's crimes and take all the party leaders that had been completely in bed with Stalin, including the head of his secret police, and even improve the conditions in the gulags, which were basically as bad as concentration camps. And he wanted them to be more in line with traditional prisons. Now, you might be thinking, okay, political reform, that sounds pretty ambitious. What's that going to mean for all those people in Eastern Europe? Well, Eastern Europe says political reforms? Yes, please, we'll have some of those. And so you see these Hungarian uprisings of 1956, the Polish uprising also of 1956. And they say, okay, we want to have some of that political reform. Can we have multiple parties? Can we have freedom of expression? Can we have independent press? And can we even have our own countries? Can we be independent from the Soviet Union and declare our own way? Maybe go capitalism, socialism, communism, something else? And Khrushchev says no. And he brutally repressed them with the Red Army, all the nations of the Warsaw Pact. Now, remember, the Warsaw Pact was Soviet Union's answer to NATO. So NATO, North American Treaty Association, was United States, Canada, and our Western European allies. But then Khrushchev cobbled together the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact was all of those Eastern Bloc Iron Curtain countries, as well as other Soviet socialist republics that were part of the USSR. And so they send these Warsaw Pact soldiers who, unlike NATO, are all part of the Red Army to brutally suppress the Hungarian uprising, the Polish uprising, and the Prague Spring over a decade later. And so these political reforms aren't quite as all-encompassing and are definitely not extended to these satellite nations. Instead, the people of these countries that are calling for freedom, calling for their ability to have the kind of freedom and political reform that Khrushchev had advertised, once they actually pushed for it, they were brutally suppressed, and all of their leaders were killed, and they were brought back into the fold as satellite nations under the yoke of the USSR. Now, we also need to talk about the nuclear arms race and the space race. So the space race got off to a start with Sputnik being launched. If you remember from an earlier unit, Sputnik is this tiny grapefruit-sized satellite that the Soviet Union put into orbit around the planet. Okay, so this is a literal satellite that's orbiting around around the world. Now, what this meant was that in order to boost a terrestrial Earth-based object, man-made object, into satellite orbit, they needed a massive rocket, okay? Those same massive rockets would be used as intercontinental ballistic missiles. If we can put a satellite into orbit, we can drop a nuclear bomb anywhere on the planet. And so you see these ICBMs becoming a major factor in the Cold War. Now, the arms race was not just for nukes. There was also arms races for every type of weapon system you can imagine, from tanks to armored vehicles to battleships and aircraft carriers to pistols and rifles and missiles and rockets and everything you can imagine, artillery shells. All of those were part of the arms race. But if you remember, the Soviet Union and the US could not engage in direct combat. And the reason for this is because of what we'll talk about in a minute, is mutually assured destruction. But another component of the space race is that the USSR was absolutely dominating the space race for the entire first decade or two, all the way up until the moon landing. They had all of the firsts. The first satellite in orbit, Sputnik. They had the first manned spaceflight. They also had the first animal put into space. They had the first man put into orbit, the first two men put into orbit, the first woman in space, the first space probe of a planetary environment in Venus. Okay, they kept just destroying the United States, who was literally blowing itself up trying to catch up. We lost so many rockets trying to catch up. Just today, SpaceX lost another rocket. So here in 2023, we still have trouble getting things into orbit, especially very large rocket ships. So the Soviets took advantage of their Nazi scientists that they had brought to the USSR with their own version of Project Paperclip after World War II, as well as their homegrown scientists. And they were able to defeat the United States all the way up until the moon landing. Kennedy called for the moonshot at the beginning of the 1960s. And while he did not survive to see the moon landing, it did represent what many call the end of the space race. And the Soviet Union was never able to match the United States' ability to go to the moon, although it's been a while since we've been back. So we're part of the reason why that rocket was being launched today, which unfortunately exploded in midair, was to start sending people back to the moon in the next few years. Now, you've probably seen this graph before. I think we saw it in an earlier checkpoint or PFA, but one thing that you'll notice is there are many, many nuclear warheads. We're talking tens of thousands from both the US and the USSR. And while the USSR did eclipse the US back during the 1970s, this was more than enough to blow up the entire world. Now, you'll see that they start going downward. This is because of the arms proliferation treaties that were passed. There was many of those passed over the years. But because there were so many nukes, it meant that it was mutually assured destruction, or MAD. There were so many nukes, they could blow up the entire world, kill all life on Earth, create nuclear winter. And so you couldn't use them. There has not been a nuclear bomb used in war since World War II. And this is because of deterrence. Deterrence is a word that means basically to stop people from doing something. So it's like the sign you put up, or your neighbor puts up, that says, trespassers will be shot, or beware of dog. It's not like they're going and shooting people every day, but they're deterring people with the threat of shooting them, or they're deterring people with the threat of a vicious guard dog. In this way, the nuclear weapons with the principle of mutually assured destruction were a deterrent to direct conflict between the US and the USSR. And that's why it was a Cold War and not a hot war. Now, you might have thought, but what about all those weapons that they were making that weren't nuclear, all the conventional weapons? Well, those end up getting used as part of the proxy wars. And the USSR, this shows, exactly how the Russians were trying, like a bear balancing on a ball on top of this delicate economy. And frequently over the years, that economy broke down, especially in the 1940s, but in the 80s as well. And so Russia had a really hard time with this centralized, autocratic, government-controlled economy. One of the benefits of capitalism, it's not a perfect system, but it definitely is more efficient in allocating resources than a centralized system. When you got a bunch of bureaucrats in Moscow trying to decide how many factories you need to build to make toasters, how many factories you need to build AK-47s, how many factories you need to build MiG fighter jets. They ended up building a lot more AK-47s and MiG fighter jets than they did toaster ovens and refrigerators and dishwashers and the basic goods that we take for granted here in the West were just not available in the Soviet Union. And then a big reason for that is because of all these proxy wars that were being fought. This is a pretty comprehensive list of many of the different proxy wars that happened during the Cold War. And there are dozens of them, I think over 60 right here, in every single continent around the world except Antarctica. And these caused tremendous amount of suffering. All parties involved expended millions and millions of dollars in weapons and supplies and soldiers, and tens of thousands of lives in each of these, if not millions, were lost to these proxy wars. So while some would say, well, the Cold War wasn't a hot war, well, it sure was if you were in any of these countries. Now, one thing that you might have heard before is the concept of the third world. The third world doesn't mean just a poor or undeveloped country. It's kind of colloquially used that way today. But at the time of the Cold War, the first world represented capitalist countries allied with the West, NATO countries, the US, Canada, and our Western European allies. Second world represented Soviet countries, communist countries, the Soviet Union, their various Soviet socialist republics, as well as the countries of the Warsaw Pact and the Eastern Bloc nations. And so the third world represented non-aligned, independent countries that weren't part of either of those paradigms. Countries like Mexico or even India. So it didn't just mean poor countries, but many of these countries here under the proxy wars were third world countries that were being fought over by the first world countries and the second world countries in order for the prestige or the ability to pull them into the fold. And like I said earlier, there was massive amount of expenditure and suffering, and it basically bankrupted the Soviet Union to have to prosecute all these wars. It didn't do much better for the United States. The United States struggled as well during the 1970s and 1980s with things called stagflation. But in particular, the Soviet Union was not able to balance with their central authoritarian communist system. They were not able to prosecute all these wars and take care of their own people. And so at the end of the day, do people want guns to kill third world revolutionaries, or do they want a nice kitchen? This is a scene from what was known as the kitchen debate, where then Vice President Richard Nixon was showing off all of the consumer goods that we have here in the United States. And Nikita Khrushchev looks at it and says, well, that's nice, but we can blow up every one of your cities and lay waste to your entire country. And Nixon's like, okay, well, check out this sweet oven and this nice dish detergent. And it's funny because Khrushchev thought he was portraying strength by saying how powerful and strong his country was, but you can't eat MiG fighter jets. You can't wash your dishes with an AK-47. And eventually his people would be clamoring for these kind of luxuries that the West provided its people in abundance. And we saw this in the Berlin crisis, where people in Berlin, East Berlin, saw how wealthy they were in West Berlin and would leave in droves to the point where they had to build a wall to keep them from emigrating out of their country. And this would be a problem that plagued communism for the entire Cold War and only got worse and more pronounced as the Cold War went on. And so here you see soup kitchen lines in the Soviet Union during the 1980s. And these races bankrupted the USSR. The space race, the arms race, spending all the money on Olympics and those kind of things, and all those proxy wars meant that there were food shortages and few consumer goods. So Soviet people did not get the necessities that they wanted and needed. Now, during the 1970s, you see Richard Nixon go into power in the United States, and you also see Leonid Brezhnev. And both of them had a lot of domestic issues, and they also were struggling with some of these proxy wars internationally. And so they wanted to do a thing called détente. Now, détente is a French word that just means dialing it back, being less militaristic, being less antagonistic, trying to have more friendly relations. And so they did on the surface. But as this political cartoon shows, they still had all those nukes, and they still had all those proxy wars happening around the world. And they also had lots of corruption problems at home. Nixon also went to China and courted them. He was the first president to go visit communist China and did things like ping pong diplomacy. And for a while, détente was working. There was things like SALT, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which is a big reason why you see some of these graphs going down back here on this. And the SALT was not a single series of talks, but it was several talks that were had. And these talks had teeth. They weren't just the two nations saying, okay, maybe we should have fewer nukes. They said, no, we're going to specifically reduce a category of nukes, like short and mid-range nukes, and we're going to eliminate them entirely. We're going to no longer have those. Maybe we won't have testing anymore. And each time they had one of these treaties, they would then follow it up with things like the International Atomic Energy Agency, or these inspectors who would go out, they were independent, and they would verify that both countries were in fact reducing their nuclear arsenals. And they did. We have far fewer nuclear weapons than we did 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and it's because of détente and these strategic arms limitation talks. And so they were a very positive part of détente. But towards the end of the 70s, Nixon ends up having to resign in disgrace because of the Watergate scandal and basically spying in his own country on his political adversaries. And Brezhnev is embroiled in the Afghanistan war, which causes an incredible amount of suffering, loss of life, and ends up becoming worse than Vietnam for the United States for the Soviet Union. And so détente sort of starts breaking down towards the end of the 70s. You see Carter come into power, and he struggled greatly with international relations, especially because of the Iran hostage crisis. And then we get into the 80s. And the 1980s are a big shift. This is when the Cold War basically, for all intents and purposes, ends. And it's because of these two men right here. Now, Reagan is not the person you would think would end the Cold War, because he came in guns blazing. He came in saying, this is an evil empire. The Soviet Union, you guys are oppressing your people. He goes into Berlin and says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And it's pretty hostile talk. I mean, he, on top of that, decides rather than scaling back the amount we're spending on the military, he ramps it up. He decides we're going to have Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative. We're going to put lasers in space that could shoot nukes, ICBMs, and MIRVs right out of the sky. And it didn't ever really work, but he knew that we had an edge when it came to computer technology, and that our economy, for all its troubles, was vastly outperforming the Soviet one. And so he thought that he could outspend the Soviets and bankrupt them by spending so much money on weapons and weapon systems and defense systems. Now, this may or may not have worked had Gorbachev not stepped on the scene. Brezhnev dies during the 1980s. He's replaced by a couple incompetent guys who'd also quickly die. And then Gorbachev comes in. And Gorbachev is the real game changer. He comes in and he introduces policies that he feels are going to drastically transform the lived experience of people in the Soviet Union. Things like glasnost, which means transparency or openness, basically allowing the people of the Soviet Union to see what's happening with their government and hold their leaders accountable for being corrupt or for not addressing their concerns. He implements perestroika, or restructuring and reform, which allows both political and economic reform. And those economic reforms, that restructuring of the state economy, greatly contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because as their economy started integrating and exchanging more with the West, you started seeing massive exchange of ideas, of people, and you start seeing more and more people, just like they did back in the 60s and 70s and 50s, in these Eastern European Soviet bloc countries, calling for that reform at home and even calling for their own independence. And this time, because Gorbachev is scaling back the military so that he can invest more domestically, he greatly reduces the size of the Red Army. And he makes it so that they can't and they won't respond to these revolutions happening in former Soviet bloc countries, soon to be former. And so you have the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And this is actual footage from 1989. So East Berliners, when they heard that they were going to have reforms, they were pushing their hardline president Honecker to allow them to start going to West Berlin again. And he initially was calling for his soldiers to fire upon them, but then they eventually replaced him and decided that they were going to tear down the wall. And so this is the symbolic end of the USSR's totalitarian regime. Despite the water cannons being shot at these guys, you could see they're not worried. They're taking this thing down because they did not want to be cut off from their German brethren. And soon thereafter, you see the East and West Germany unite into just Germany. And this was a signal to the rest of the Eastern Bloc that independence was possible. And that under Gorbachev, they would not be brutally suppressed the way that they had been so many times before. So lastly, we're going to talk about the actual fall of the USSR. So in 1991, it ceased to exist. It began in 1990 with Lithuania, and then Georgia, Estonia, Latvia. You had countries like Azerbaijan and Armenia, both part of the Soviet bloc, the Warsaw Pact, fighting civil wars against each other and using Soviet troops against Soviet troops. And this caused a tremendous amount of tension and pressure inside the Soviet Union. And so eventually they just all started going their own way and forming their own countries and seceding from the Soviet Union and stopping to be Soviet socialist republics. And then by the end of it, you see Boris Yeltsin become president of the Russian SSR. And then after a series of events and an attempted military coup, he ends up meeting behind Gorbachev's back with Ukraine and Belarus and dissolves the USSR in December 26, 1991. And basically puts Gorbachev out of a job. Gorbachev is like, dude, uncool. Okay, I'm not in charge anymore because there's no USSR anymore. And he creates the Commonwealth of Independent States. Now, Boris Yeltsin is a very corrupt individual. He's by no means the kind of leader that Gorbachev was. And he quickly starts under that authoritarian centralized economic system. There was a lot of corruption. There was a ton of incentive because people weren't getting the things that they needed from the centralized system. They would bribe their local officials or the higher up officials to get what they wanted. And so there was a ton of corruption. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, all of those corrupt leaders, whether they were party leaders or KGB officials, they basically got put into power. And before, you couldn't, as an individual or a company, own resources. They were all owned by the state. But now you have these massive industries that have been built up during the Soviet Union, during the Cold War, going to individuals. And so Yeltsin could point to a guy and say, you're in charge of tin. Point to another guy, you're a steel guy. Point to another guy, you're in charge of our railways. You're in charge of our warehouses, and basically created the oligarchs and promoted all these party and KGB officials to be now billionaires that owned massive industries, and then basically turned it over to the Russian mafia. And then you had people like Vladimir Putin, who had been the chief intelligence officer of the KGB, who his entire job was making sure that propaganda and spycraft and active measures against the West to basically spread fake news and undermine people's faith in Western democracies. He ends up becoming president in the late 90s and basically throws all of Yeltsin guys out, puts all of his own guys in charge of the different industries, creates the oligarchs, and makes all of them get their power from him. So 25 years later, he's still in charge of Russia. And any oligarchs that ever think that they can maybe free themselves from his yoke or seize power for themselves find themselves falling out of buildings, getting poisoned, or being just shot. And so he's basically converted the country of Russia into an authoritarian government again, and is using his power to invade countries like Ukraine and trying to bring them back into the fold of Russia. And the people of Ukraine, many of whom remember what it was like living under the Soviet Union, they want nothing to do with that. They have enough problems with corruption as it is. They don't want to see the kind of corruption that they experienced underneath the Soviet Union or watch all their national resources be plundered by oligarchs. And so, in many ways, the Cold War, while it ended in 1991, it never ended with China. We're still in a Cold War with China. And it has been restarted with the conflict in Ukraine because we have NATO and Russia once again fighting through a proxy war. So thank you. I hope that was enough. That should be everything you need to do well on the PFAs. And reach out if you need if you have any questions. All right. Have a great rest of your day.